Welcome back! Today we're talking about Shakespeare and plot. As you can see here, I have drawn a plot diagram upon my board. A plot diagram is also sometimes called Freytag's triangle. It measures the intensity of the action throughout a piece of literature. You probably learned about this pretty early on. The first part of the plot diagram is called the Exposition. What happens in the Exposition? Well, during that part of the story, we learn who our characters are, we learn what our setting is, and we learn about our conflict, which is the central problem of the piece. Next, we have the rising action, which is where the conflict begins to escalate through a series of actions. After that, we have our climax, which is the pinnacle of the story, the pinnacle of the action. In an action film, that might be seen as the largest explosion. Or in other stories, it could simply be a significant turning point, which leads to the ultimate conclusion. Fourth, we have the falling action, which is the point at which, after the climax has happened, the story begins to fall into its conclusion. Finally, we have the denouement, or the resolution of the story, in which all the loose ends are tied up and the story is fully unraveled. You might have noticed a second bump in the downhill slide. This is an extra aspect added to the falling action, which holds the story on for a little bit longer. We might call this a second conflict. We've already really gotten past the big turning point, the biggest moment, but there's still a reason for us to hang on and find out what happens. This becomes especially important in the Shakespearean plot. Although all plots have some kind of conflict that needs to be worked out, not all of them are the same kind of conflict. For instance, we have tragedies, where the hero struggles against something, ultimately makes a mistake leading to his or her doom, but yet gains some self-awareness and some understanding through all that. Those are intense and deep kinds of plots. We also have comedy, which can be much lighter and end on a much happier note. We still follow the same process through the conflict. Now, a Shakespearean play has 5 acts, which is interesting because our plot diagram has 5 parts. Normally, in a big blockbuster action film, we would have a plot diagram shaped something like this. Quick exposition, long rising action, big explosion climax, and then a quick jump to our denouement. Shakespeare's plays are much more balanced. In Act 1 of a Shakespeare play, we expect exposition. We expect a setting up of the characters, we expect a new understanding of the setting, we expect to find out what the problem is, what the conflict is. In Act 2 of a Shakespeare play, that conflict begins to escalate through the rising action. But by Act 3, we've already potentially reached a climax. Certainly this point could be up for debate, but it's pretty interesting to examine Shakespeare's plays as having the central climax in the middle of the play, in Act 3. If you know to look for in Act 3, you'll find some interesting things there. But that poses a bit of a problem. We still have 2 acts to go, and we've finished our climax. What are we gonna do? That's a lot of play to get through after already hitting the highest point. It might help to consider it not as the biggest explosion, but again as that moment of turning. It's the point at which the main character makes a decision which is going to change everything for the rest of the play. If it's a tragedy, it will lead that character ultimately to his or her doom. If it's a comedy, it will ultimately lead to everything working out. Consider some of the big plays. Romeo and Juliet. Exposition. We find out who our characters are. We're set in Verona with this big social conflict. Our conflict, we have a huge fight between these 2 families, and yet 2 of them are in love. Rising action. Romeo and Juliet decide to cast all safety to the wind and be together no matter what. They make arrangements between their friends to work things out. The friar thinks that maybe we can resolve this big problem with the families if only these 2 will get together, and so he marries them, leading us to the top of the rising action. What happens in Act 3? The climax. What does Romeo do that changes everything? He kills Tybalt. From then on, Romeo is doomed. We hold on to a few other moments of hope through the last 2 acts, but really, at that point, our lovers are toast. Or think of a comedy. Midsummer Night's Dream. You've got this huge, complex love square going on, and all these fairies mixing magic and everything going crazy. But ultimately, where is everything straightened out? Act 3. the climax. So if Act 4 is the falling action, how do we sustain that action? Well, this little bump that I mentioned becomes even more important in a Shakespeare play. In a comedy, that bump is the second conflict. It's one more problem that we have to work out before everything's ultimately resolved. In a tragedy, it's one more hope just to keep us hanging on for a little bit longer. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, Juliet's plan to pretend poison herself and send message to Romeo gives us the hope that maybe things will work out after all. No, they're doomed. And finally, Act 5 is the denouement, in which everything is unwound. Keeping this plot diagram in mind while reading a Shakespeare play can really help you to get a feel for how he lays out the action. If I'm in Act 1, I should be looking for my most important characters, I should be figuring out what my problem is, and I should be understanding how the setting is going to influence that. If I'm in Act 2, I'm following the pattern that's leading me up to climax. What actions are the characters taking that are going to lead to that turning point? If I'm in Act 3, I really need to be keeping a good eye out for that decision that the character makes that's really going to change things. That's going to set the story in a different direction. If I'm in Act 4, I'm looking for that second conflict if it's a comedy, or a second hope if it's a tragedy. And finally, Act 5, I'm looking for the ways that the whole story is undone and brought to a conclusion. If it's a tragedy, I expect probably a bloodbath, everyone to die. If it's a comedy, I expect a wedding and everyone to come together in happiness and marriage and ceremony. Thanks for watching. You can watch some of my other Shakespeare videos over here, or click to subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. You can watch some of my other Shakespeare videos over here. Thanks for watching. You can watch